Okay, so I would like to say a few words as welcome remarks. And well, thank you very much again, everyone, for this meeting. So generally speaking, the disease-modifying drugs for MS are relatively expensive. So the use of off-label treatment may be critically important in some countries and for some patients. We would like to discuss the recommendations made by MSIF, which is called MOLT, MSIF Off-Label Treatment. And this project has been led by Dr. Joanna Larson. So after some introductions and short lectures by the experts, we would like to have a Q&A session. I would like everybody to participate actively in the discussion session. Joanna, would you like to say a few words?
Thanks, Kazuo. No, that's fine. I will let Bassem take the lead on the next item. Thank you.
Okay, so the first speaker is Professor Bassem Yamout, the president of MENACTRIMS, and he's going to tell us about the introduction to MOLT. Bassem?
Yes, thank you very much, Kazuo. So I'm going to try to put in context what is MOLT and what we have been doing and what's really the objective of all this work. So this is our committee. Shanthi from Malaysia and myself are clinical chairs, and Holger, who's with us today, also is the methodology chair, taking care of all the methodology that we use to reach our recommendations. So this is a publication we did recently, and it shows that there is really unequal access to disease-modifying therapies on label DMTs all around the world. And we can see that around 14% of countries all around the world do not have access to on-label DMTs or licensed DMTs. And this is really much worse when you go to low-income country, where 70% of low-income countries do not have access to any licensed DMT. Even with the lower middle income, it's around 30%. It gets even worse when we go to high efficacy medications, especially the monoclonal antibodies, which, as you know, are one of the major ways where we escalate our treatment in patients that are failing on first-line therapies. And if you look here again, with the low-income countries, almost 100% of the countries do not have access to this high efficacy medication. And even in the lower middle income, 50% of the patients do not have access to the high efficacy medications. So we had a problem really to deal with these patients. And we found out that actually many countries, low income or even high income, are using off-label medications to treat MS. And if you look here at this graph here on the right, and we can see, for example, that rituximab is used in almost 70% of the country off-label for MS. Again, azathioprine comes close behind it, around 68% of countries use it as off-label. And these two, for example, are used much more than dimethyl fumarate, for example, or GRADEpro. And the other advantage of this off-label is that if you look at the essential medicine list of each country, we can see that only 31% of the countries have these on-label medications for DMTs on their essential medicine list, while these off-label DMTs like azathioprine or rituximab are present on 95% of the essential medicine list countries. And the reason is, of course, because they use it for other things. These are used for rheumatological disorder, for malignancy, so they are readily available everywhere. And the major thing about using these medications is really the difference in price. And this is just a very quick look. If you look at the yearly cost of rituximab versus the yearly cost of ocrelizumab, both of which are B-cell depleting therapy with probably very similar efficacy and safety profile, and we can see that it's almost 5 to 6 times the cost. And if you go to azathioprine, of course, it's even more, 100 times difference in cost. So cost, low-income countries, off-label use of medication, these are all the data that really accumulated that prompted us really to form this MOLT committee and look into the ethical use of these off-label medication and actually produce guidelines to use this off-label medication in the right way. And this way, probably help physicians, especially in low to middle income countries, to know how to use them, how to follow patients, and at the same time, help governmental institutions and government themselves actually to have guidelines for the use of these off-label medications. So the off-label medication committee that we made, the main objective is to put these guidelines forward, and these were actually endorsed by the major neurological society around the world, like the WFN, the AAN, EAN, and the major TRIMS like PACTRIMS, MENACTRIMS, and so on. So we wanted these guidelines to be really endorsed by the major tier holders around the world, and these are our major tier 1 stakeholders, which are the WFN, the different TRIMS, and so on. And finally, after we're finished with this part, we'll have them be really discussed with the wider tier 2 stakeholders, which are the MS community at large. Our committee is really very inclusive. It has 17 members covering 14 countries and all 6 WHO regions. We have neurologists, we have MS nurses, psychologists, methodologists, even pharmacists. So we made sure that the committee includes all kinds of specialties and even patients to have really a good outlook on those guidelines. The system we used is that first we made some PICO questions that would address these medications. We decided to concentrate on only 2 medications, azathioprine and rituximab, because as I showed, these are the most commonly used off-label treatment for MS all over the world. And actually the WHO, when we applied to have medication for MS on the essential list of medicine of WHO, what they asked for is to review those 2 special medications because of their low price. We used the PICO questions initially, then we had the Cochrane team with us in the committee review all the literature about this medication. And finally, we used the GRADE methodology with the help of Holger here with us today to reach out the guidelines ultimately. And we addressed those 2 medications and the different treatment groups in relapsing remitting MS, treatment naive patients, as an escalation relapsing remitting, and in progressive MS, both as treatment naive and as escalation. And we tried to compare the medication versus no disease modifying therapy or versus the other disease modifying therapy. So this is basically the outline of our MOLT workup. I will not go through the recommendation, we're going to discuss them later, but basically we came up with recommendation based on all this methodology that I just described regarding azathioprine and rituximab in the different population that I just mentioned. So after these draft recommendations were finished, now we are here in the second step where we are consulting with our key stakeholder like we're doing today with PACTRIM to have everyone endorse them. After that, we will go on to publish these guidelines, and the final step really is to disseminate these guidelines to all countries, societies, and so on to be able to use them as needed. Thank you very much. This is just a quick review of what we've been doing. Back to Kazuo.
Well, thank you very much, Bassem. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. Any burning question that you want to ask at this point? Well, if not, let's move on. So do you have a slide?
Next speaker will be Holger, a little bit more in depth around the methodology. So Holger, please.
Sure, let me just make sure that I can share my screen here. That's perfect. Okay.
Okay.
So thanks very much for having me today. My name is Holger Schünemann. I'm a professor at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada, and was the methods chair here. I've been working in guidelines for over 20 years now, and this was a very welcome opportunity to explore some new ground. So I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the methodology that we use. We have only 10 minutes, so it's going to be a rather fly-through of about work that really has been going on for over 2 decades. Here are my conflicts. I have received payments from MSIF for this work, a consultancy fee to support the quite extensive work that we've been undertaken. I also have a few intellectual conflicts of interest that relate to leadership roles with Cochrane Canada and the Guidelines International Network that I vice chair, for which I'm the vice chair. So today, in these 10 minutes, I'll give a brief background on GRADE, that GRADE methodology, and how it is applied in guidelines in general. I will not specifically refer to our recommendations because we will discuss these recommendations, and my approach to explaining GRADE is one where I try to take colleagues out of their comfort zone of existing conditions or conditions that they are familiar with. So I wanted to emphasize a few points that I think we all covered here. What in this day and age does the guideline science suggest that we should be doing when we develop guidelines? The first is, as Bassem already suggested, there's general agreement internationally that guidelines should be developed by diverse multidisciplinary groups. They should be based on systematic reviews and the best available evidence, which is why we engaged the Cochrane team to help assist with the systematic reviews. They should be explicitly considering patient subgroups and people's values when it comes to the outcomes that are considered. There need to be clear explanations between any logical relationship of alternative care options and the outcomes that we consider. They should be minimizing distortions, biases, and conflicts of interest. They should provide a rating of the certainty of the evidence and the strength of the recommendation. And they obviously need to be revised if there's new evidence that becomes available. These are 7 criteria that are broadly put forward and accepted by organizations such as the World Health Organization, the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Science, and the Guidelines International Network. So the key issue for us, and this is very important for understanding the way that we develop these MOLT guidelines, is that usually we focus on health benefits and harms when we think about interventions, so drug interventions, for instance, but in reality, there's many more factors that influence a decision. And our approach to guideline development is one where we try to describe all of these factors for the decision maker in the guideline development process. So that adds some things like how important the outcomes are, as I already mentioned, and cost issues, or is an intervention actually feasible to implement? I'm going to give you a quick example from a guideline that we did with WHO on tuberculosis. A typical guideline recommendation may read as follows: that in patients with tuberculous meningitis, the use of corticosteroids therapy with dexamethasone or prednisolone in a tapering dose should be used. You see 2 things here. One is a certainty of the evidence that relates to how sure we are in the evidence that supports that recommendation, and the GRADE approach, which is an international accepted approach, I get back to that, asks essentially a few signaling questions that we know from research methodology, but that are highly operationalized. So for instance, what are the limitations of the underlying studies that provide the research evidence? Are the results consistent? Are they precise? So we've all heard of statistical significance and confidence intervals. That's essentially what we're addressing here. How directly the evidence applies to the population, the setting, the interventions, and outcomes that we're interested in. Is it all of the research evidence? And are there any other issues that increase our confidence in the results, for instance, when there are very large effects? The second question that we ask when we formulate a recommendation, it's expressed here, is, are there more desirable than undesirable consequences, or is it the other way around? And how clear is that potential balance? And when the balance is clear, we make a strong recommendation. What we consider here, and this goes back to the intro, that it's far more than the health benefits and harms, are issues such as resources, equity considerations, feasibility, and acceptability of the options. These are criteria also internationally accepted from the decision-making literature that inform a decision, and therefore should also help us with supporting the formulation of a recommendation. So this GRADE approach is supported by a tool, I'll get back to that we utilized here, but it is a unifying, transparent, and sensible system for grading the certainty of evidence and making decisions. It's been developed and used by major organizations globally. Over 100 organizations are actually using it. There's a network of 1,000 people that have developed this approach and continue to develop it. It's for systematic reviews, health technology assessment and guidelines. By the way, there's a network in South Korea, for instance, a great network. There's thousands of recommendations that have been formulated, over 80,000 citations to the work. And one of the good things about it is that it is highly operationalized. In other words, there's detailed guidance, more guidance than for any other approach in the context of rating the certainty. And as I said, we used our GRADEpro app to do this. To provide a little bit more background on what Bassem said, because it's important for evaluating the quality of these guidelines, I believe. So the way that this process starts, it starts with formulating the guideline panel or the guideline development group, formulating so-called PICO questions, defining the population interventions, comparators, and outcomes. Those outcomes that are important to people or critical for people in the decision-making process are the ones that we utilize in our systematic reviews or health technology assessments to compile the evidence. We provide the panel with synthesized evidence in the form of what we call evidence profiles or summary of findings tables. These are trial-tested ways of presenting information to users, in particular guideline panels. That includes a rating of the underlying certainty of the effects an intervention has on certain outcomes. And then this information is fed back to the guideline panel when the systematic reviews are done. And the panel uses so-called evidence to decision frameworks that I'll explain a little bit more in the remaining time. Evidence to decision frameworks to formulate a recommendation. The recommendations are recommendations for or against an intervention or option that determines the direction, and we make recommendations that are either strong or conditional. Conditional are also called by other groups weak recommendations, just the same concept, different terms used. But we look at the criteria that I already looked at, and then at the end of the day, there will be a guideline. Right. So why are we using GRADE? One reason is that it's used by over 100 organizations and it's considered the international standard for this approach. It's a structured approach. I already took you through this. This is the approach that we used with the MOLT guideline panels, so structured, transparent. All of the decisions that are made along these lines are actually demonstrated. And again, just to quickly reiterate, we have these signaling questions for the certainty of evidence that I took you through. These are standard research methodology questions that we have operationalized. One other reason for using GRADE is that it was innovative in that it is ethically driven. We ask specific questions, as I already mentioned, about health equity, and there are signaling questions to health equity in terms of what the effects of an intervention are on particular subgroups, for instance. And we asked about acceptability. And also for this, we tried to identify literature in order to, or evidence in order to make these decisions clear. As I said, this approach is highly operationalized. There's 50 articles that describe how GRADE is utilized in guidelines. And we obviously try to follow this to the word, also looking at the handbook. It's transparent. As Bassem mentioned, there's a clear question. There's these evidence profiles. There's evidence to decision frameworks. We consider conflicts of interest very carefully. And there's a rationale for the recommendations. Let me tell you briefly about these evidence to decision criteria. This is actually coming from a large EU project with key partner organizations where we developed this framework. And the framework, again, is one where the criteria that are generally believed to be important for a recommendation and then a decision are sequentially worked through with the guideline group we appraise evidence, and then we make judgments about that evidence. And then, you know, to be complete, so these evidence to decision frameworks, again, have the question, this assessment that I just mentioned based on the criteria. We make judgments, we add additional considerations that may be relevant for users of the recommendations, and then we draw conclusions, in this case, recommendations. We provide the justification, and there's different ways of presenting this information. And in our particular case, we took a population perspective to that. So a few other things, the recommendations are interpretable. We've worked for a long time on explaining what a strong and conditional recommendation means for different target groups, including clinicians, patients, researchers, and policymakers. It helps us identify research gaps. The ratings of the certainty and the strength of recommendation directly links to research priorities. Mentioned the support by an international network of people actually doing this work. There's over 20 centers and networks globally. We have tools that support us. And one important thing is always that GRADE is educational and fun. We utilize a standard educational program for the guideline panel members to participate in. It's called InGuide. So that they come with some background information to the actual work that is being done, which is by all means quite complicated, but the background is necessary in order to really make informed decisions in a guideline development. Thanks so much for your attention. This is, again, as I said, it's a fly-through. It's like in Star Wars when you travel from one planet to another. I'm very happy to answer any questions or obviously refer to you to more detailed background.
Well, Holger, thank you very much for the nice summary of the GRADE system and the other methodological issues. Let's move on to the next topic. The third talk is the impact of MOLT. The speaker is Dr. Shanthi Viswanathan of Kuala Lumpur Hospital, Malaysia. Dr. Shanthi, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone from PACTRIMS. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I think, Holger, you need to unshare, or Joanna?
That was me. I had to unshare. Thanks, Shanthi. Done.
No worries. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Yeah, great. And I'll just go to the beginning. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. Joanna and team asked me to just discuss a little bit about the potential impact of off-label treatment and a bit of the advocacy activities. So in this outline, I'm just going to cover 3 areas, basically whether off-label treatments are currently used or more available in the national setting by looking at Malaysia. And I'm just going to discuss with all of you in the second part about whether they are more affordable and accessible to patients with MS. I mean, basically, we're working on the virtue of an evidence-based option where actually there is none. And then lastly, I'll just cover whether this MOLT guidelines would have potentially an impact locally as well as regionally, because the medications are familiar to local regional neurologists. It's feasible, it's accessible, and it's a sustainable option for local regional use. So this is us here, Malaysia, within the Southeast Asian region, and we are under the Western Pacific WHO region. Our GDP is about 33, our population is about 33.7 million, and we've got a GDP about 13,000. And we are considered an upper middle income economy. However, if you look at the Malaysian case and experience, it's basically an example of public-private healthcare system challenges, where there is challenges in terms of providing sufficient access and financing to high-cost medications. And off-label treatments, ladies and gentlemen, offer us a temporary option till on-label treatments are available. And in some of the others, it actually offers us a permanent option, especially in those who show good response and continue to be unable to access regulatory approved DMTs. And if you look at the screen on my right, you can see that this is our national medicines list, and many of the off-label treatments that the MSIF Atlas showed are available: azathioprine, cyclophosphamide, rituximab, and methotrexate. So off-label treatments are easily available as they are already available on our Malaysian Essentials Medicines list, and they're also available in the National Pharmaceutical Hospital list. And furthermore, they are actually mentioned in our clinical practice guideline on MS version 1 in 2015, where you can see it here. If you can see my arrow mentioning it over here in the treatment of highly active and aggressive MS. So if we talk about generics and biosimilars of on-label treatments, however, this is a very challenging area and we're unable to bring it in due to the lack of local distributorship. None are willing to bring it in at the current time. And local originator companies also have concerns about this. Furthermore, patients with MS have actually tried bringing in biosimilars with very unique methods of trying to bring it in. And some of them have actually been caught by local authorities and given warnings. So that's just to give you an impression of what's been happening. So if you look at the off-label treatments that are available in our Essentials Medicines list locally, azathioprine, methotrexate, cyclophosphamide, IVIG, and rituximab, all of them have already got local drug committee approval. They're available in the hospital formularies. They're easily available and they're easily reimbursed. And now we have locally biosimilars of rituximabs. So these off-label options definitely offer an option. Especially when you look at rituximab, it offers an option for patients to access a high efficacy monoclonal treatment. So this is a very busy slide, but if you could just focus on the areas in gray. If you look at the other on-label treatments, comparing them to the off-label treatments in gray, you find that there's definitely a vast difference in between the cost annually in terms of rituximab, either the off-label treatment original or the biosimilar, as well as azathioprine and methotrexate as compared to conventional on-label treatments. And this is definitely a tremendous difference. So when and why do we use off-label treatments? We use it as bridging therapy when on-label treatment is, until on-label treatments are available. We use off-label treatments as they are already mentioned in our Malaysian guideline of 2015. We use it mainly for highly active or aggressive MS. So there's a lot of local familiarity with these drugs. A lot of these off-label treatments are actually neurologist initiated. And the basic premise here is we want to protect patients with MS health. Other causes why we use off-label treatments, because basically it's driven by the lack of options and limited resources. And in fact, patients with MS, when it comes to rituximab, they're able to cope with the infrequent maintenance treatments better. They find the monitoring comfortable, and they are able to come, even though logistically, to the hospitals for the infusions. So recently, what we did is we did a survey amongst the 13 state neurologists in the country. Malaysia is made up of 13 states. And when you look on the column on the right, you find that majority of the neurologists in these states were actually asking for off-label treatments in terms of rituximab, aside from some of the common on-label treatments as you see on the left side of the table. So these principles have been highlighted very nicely by Professor Yamout already, so I'm not going to go through it, but just want to highlight that off-label use of DMTs is driven by the need to protect a person's health. So this is our guideline, and I've already shown you this, where we position some of the off-label treatments, especially in terms of when we want to escalate therapy for highly active or aggressive patients to highly active treatments. So when we give off-label treatments, we usually, it's a shared decision-making between the patient with MS and the healthcare provider. Risks and benefits are explained, and I'll show you our off-label form. And in terms of access, azathioprine is free. Rituximab, on a case-by-case basis, some patients may self-purchase it. And in the public hospitals, it's fully subsidized. So rituximab at the moment in the country is still the originator drug. However, we do have biosimilars available. So this is an example of an off-label treatment form that we routinely use in the country. So if you can see, the patient is given verbal information about the drug. They have sufficient time to consider the risk versus benefits. They have the opportunity to ask questions. They understand that their decision is voluntary, and they understand the risk and the benefits before they sign the form in the presence of a witness. So if we look at the MOLT guidelines, how would this help a country like Malaysia or some of the other countries within the region? So if you look at the rituximab recommendations, rituximab is recommended as first choice treatment compared with other DMTs. And this recommendation depends on whether other DMTs are available or affordable. So how would we use it? So if you look at this particular case, she's a 19-year-old female who came in 2020. Clinically, as well as on MRI, undoubtedly, she's got high lesion load. She's got multiple poor prognostic factors. And obviously, she needs high efficacy treatment. She has no access and she consents to off-label treatment after hearing the risk versus benefits. And she started on rituximab. And for the last 2 years, she's been relapse-free and her MRI is reasonably quiet. So in some cases, we're not able to access even rituximab. So this is a 43-year-old lady who's very dyscognitive, and she presents with mania and psychosis as a relapse. And you can see she's got this right frontal lobe lesion. So in her, we needed to rescue her. So we gave her cyclophosphamide, and she's on maintenance cyclophosphamide while awaiting on-label treatment. So these are examples of how we would use off-label treatments. What about azathioprine? Well, for us, azathioprine provides an option where none exists. So if you look at the MOLT recommendations, it suggests azathioprine compared with no disease-modifying therapy for relapsing forms of MS, and especially when there's lack of availability or affordability of any treatment option. So let's look at this particular case, case number 3. She's 21 years old, and obviously she's having multiple attacks here, 4 within a period of 2 years. MRI lesion load is quite high. She obviously has highly active relapsing MS, multiple poor prognostic factors. She fulfills the criteria for some sort of high efficacy treatment. She can't afford on-label treatment because she's actually a non-citizen. Her mother is Malaysian, but her father is from Indonesia, and she doesn't have local immigration documents. So she consents to off-label treatment, but can't afford rituximab, and she's put on azathioprine. So she continues the azathioprine, and interestingly, she has done relatively okay, even though her EDSS is quite high and she's ambulating with support. She's finally got money for an MRI, so we're going to excitedly see what the results of the MRI is. And I can't tell you how her feeling, her feeling of at least I'm on some sort of treatment, it is indescribable. And azathioprine only costs 256 ringgit per month. So let's look at the last case. This is a case of a Syrian. We do get UNHCR refugees here in Malaysia as well. And she's young, she's got highly active MS, and she's got ongoing relapses. She actually brought with her from Syria these vials of IV metalpred because she knows that every time she has a relapse, she can get the metalpred and she'll probably get better. So she's got no access to treatment. We offered her azathioprine or rituximab. She can't afford rituximab, and so currently she's on azathioprine, and we're following her up in our clinic. So we've used off-label treatment also during the COVID pandemic, because locally during the pandemic, there were a lot of movement control orders, and administrative offices were closed. There were logistic issues in terms of delivery of on-label treatments. And this is where we had to use some of the off-label treatments like rituximab, cyclophosphamide, or IVIG as bridging. So how would we use the MOLT recommendations for advocacy here within Malaysia or within the region? It provides us for the first time evidence-based material for counseling on off-label treatment. It gives us a bit of evidence for the first time globally as well as regionally, and it's useful in counseling. Secondly, it'll help us to improve advocacy for cheaper high efficacy treatment, especially rituximab. It'll help us to engage our key opinion leaders to drive access for basic MS drugs such as rituximab to be included in our hospital formularies, specifically for MS, and hopefully in the future, maybe develop our own and adapt for our own off-label treatment guidelines locally. It provides us an option where actually previously there was none, and it fills the gap. And it's basically used as bridging till on-label treatment is available. So to conclude, the MOLT work can be used to leverage on improved advocacy and improve access to treatment for patients with MS local regionally, where before there was no options. And this work actually echoes some of the aims by the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, which is good health and reduce inequality for all. And it also echoes the work by the WFN, the World Federation of Neurology, in conjunction with the WHO's 75th World Health Assembly in Geneva, and the Intersectoral Global Action Plan on Epilepsy and Other Neurological Disorders. So this is basically how we would use it. And I thank you kindly for your attention. And I guess I'm open for questions as well. Thank you.
Well, Shanthi, thank you very much for the nice talk. So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A and discussions. Any questions or comments from any of you? Before this session, I think some COC members sent their comments to these recommendations, and one of them was about some COC members were a bit concerned about the level of efficacy of eculizumab and of azathioprine, although the efficacy of rituximab may be okay. Well, Bassem or Shanthi, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I can comment on that. We had very long discussion about the issue of azathioprine and the comparison to the basic DMTs like interferon. The problem is that with azathioprine, the evidence and the studies are old. We're talking about the 90s, when the MS population, as you know, Kazuo, very different. And the only studies where we could see, where we did have a comparison between azathioprine and DMTs were with interferons. We found like 2 or 3 studies in our concurrent review. But the problem that these studies compared to our current methodology are really archaic with the methodology, the confounding variables and so on, not like using modern scientific evidence for trials. Although some of them were controlled and randomized. But in these small studies, azathioprine was shown to be as effective or sometimes superior in efficacy to the interferons. So based on that, the recommendation was clear that with such kind of evidence, we did recommend azathioprine in case there are no other disease-modifying therapies, like the case presented by Shanthi, a patient like the lady with the father from Indonesia. She cannot afford anything. She has MS. There is nothing to treat her. So our recommendations are very specific to that point. But in case other on-label DMTs, including interferon, are available, then the recommendation does not apply. So this is ultimately based on the evidence that we had, the recommendation that we came up with.
Well, thank you, Bassem, for your comments. Any other questions or comments? Kevin, do you have any questions?
Yeah, thanks Kazuo, and thanks to the speakers for their presentations. I guess my comment is going to be more about the application of the recommendations. I understand why the committee divided the countries to high income, middle and high and low middle income. But actually, even if we talk about high income countries, I think these off-label treatments are useful. And I think it's not so much about whether you come from a high income country or not, but it's more the health economics and the health reimbursement structure that plays a part in the access of medications to our patients. So the example I'm going to give would be from my own country, because in Singapore, I'm not sure what the classification is. I suspect it's probably high. And we do have a wide range of on-label treatments available. But the trouble is that our patients have to pay out of pocket. And so even though it's available, there is still a significant proportion of the population who may not be able to access these drugs. And so the off-label treatments are going to be very helpful.
I fully agree, Kevin, with what you said. And actually, one of the high-income countries in the world, which is Sweden, the most commonly used DMT is actually rituximab in off-label. And even here in the United Arab Emirates, which is also a very high-income country. And once we have expats, non-citizens that are here, we are using rituximab frequently because they don't have any insurance covering their DMTs. And as I showed, rituximab is like 5 to 6 times cheaper than the other B-cell depleting therapies. So I fully agree that even in high-income countries, such guidelines will also be helpful. But they will make a huge difference in low-income countries. And I can tell you from my experience in Lebanon, where we had the Syrian and the Palestinian refugees, they did not have any coverage for any DMTs. And once we used rituximab with this high efficacy results, it made a huge difference in their life as patients with MS. So this is basically the logic behind our discussion between high and low income countries.
Thank you.
Can
Kazuo,
I make a
think you're
comment?
muted again.
I would like to make some comments, please.
Sure, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So, you know, these recommendations are even without any standard recommendation as you're proposing. This is the sort of thing that we do in our part of the world as well. So but I'm not sure how much of leverage you can draw from your recommendations, because in a country like ours, we don't have any national guidelines that we need to follow independently, depending upon the ground reality. Individual specialists, you know, provide care in the way they can to the kind of population they see. I see really very low income patients, and most of my patients are dependent on generic versions of label therapies and you know, off-label therapies. And the drug control, you know, the organization is very loosely put together as to approve drugs in the country, but not specifically for any indication. So if I need to use rituximab, I can go ahead and use it, but without any official sanctioning from anywhere. But the sad truth is that the so-called national essential list that is there, it does not do the work it should do to disseminate free drugs in case they're available to all parts of India. It generally, rituximab is available in large metropolitan cities where the governmental institutions can provide. But in a city like mine, which is it doesn't have any access because the government hospitals are not, you know, they don't distribute rituximab to the government hospitals. And even azathioprine, that a lot of people who have dependent on for after renal transplant, even that is available very erratically to the very poor. So therefore, our strength in India is generic. So we rely on generic azathioprine, which is half the cost of the regular azathioprine. And so our deal is with all these larger pharmaceutical companies, which provide us directly, you know, at low cost without including a margin. So therefore, rituximab is very affordable as a result of that. Generic dimethyl fumarate is quite affordable. So I think the choices that you make is very much area dependent, and you know, so I do not know that one recommendation is going to make a difference. In order to be able to use this recommendation to leverage, it has to be through the government. And I'm sure you know, in India, we are a land of red tape, and you know, even to include MS in the disability list, I think it took around 8 to 10 years just to get that included among. So I don't see that a recommendation of this will have a leveraging power, you know.
Shanthi, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so just sharing our experience. Recently, we had a kind of sharing between MSIF, our local MS society, and we had someone from the Ministry of Health. So during the sharing, I think Joanna, you were there as well, towards the end, sorry. So that during that sharing, what happened was we laid out all the work that had been done by another country in Egypt, and also shared with them the work that MSIF has been doing and is doing with regard to the off-label treatment. It was really an eye-opener for the local MS patients because they didn't know that this kind of thing was going on. And for the local government official, I must say that it really was, it really opened her eyes. So I think one thing that this work is going to do is going to create a bit of awareness, number one. And number two, these two drugs that are available, the azathioprine and rituximab, these are drugs which are already very easily available on the essential medicines list. And whether they are biosimilar or generic, or whether they are the still originator drugs. So these drugs are well known to a lot of regional neurologists. And I've just done a survey amongst the Southeast Asian neurologists. So they're very aware about these kind of drugs. So it depends on the champions, the key opinion leaders, the KOLs. So that's why my last slide showed the KOLs. It depends on the KOLs improving the awareness amongst the government officials. And when we go for the meetings with government officials, they want some kind of data. And that kind of data and evidence, this is where the off-label treatment guidelines will actually help us to leverage when we meet administrators. So I think this is where the work is going to truly make a difference and show us how we're going to be able to get to at least get some basic drugs to be available in these kind of regions where we don't have access. So we are going to use the off-label guidelines are going to help us to fill a gap where there's no lack of awareness about what drugs are available, lack of awareness amongst administrators about drugs which are economic. That's the basic thing. Whenever we meet the administrators, they're always asking us about drugs which don't you have alternatives? Aren't the alternatives there? What's the evidence for the alternatives? Are they, are they economically cheaper as compared to the on-label treatments? So I'll give you an example. Recently, we tried to gain access for cladribine for a patient for 2 years. The basic question that administrator told me is that to treat 5 patients, you need $500,000. Don't you have another option? Don't you have another off-label option, something that is cheaper? So this is where if we had the guidelines, we can leverage on this and we can actually help patients gain access. So I think it's awareness, having black and white guidelines that help guide us in when we meet administrators and actually leveraging on these kind of things. Thank you. See, there's not going to be any impetus by the drug companies to invest in doing trials on rituximab on azathioprine. We know that. So if we have this kind of guidelines, at least it is a starting point. Thanks.
Kazuo, I think you're muted again.
Now you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay. Shanthi, thank you very much for your comments. And Kevin commented that the application of the guidelines will have to be contextualized by the local neurologists with the local stakeholders. Let me turn to Professor Byung-Jung Kim of Korea. I believe that Korea has many treatment choices and everybody is insured by the national healthcare system. What do you think about this issue from the viewpoint of Korea?
I think the recommendations are very reasonable. In Korea, azathioprine and rituximab are not covered by the insurance, government insurance, and the on-label DMT are covered by the government insurance 90% and only 10% for the 10% patient pay. So if the doctors prescribe rituximab, we have to process of IRB and permission from the government. It takes several months, so it is not easy to use rituximab. And for the azathioprine, we cannot prescribe for the RRMS patient. So it's a different situation, I think. But some countries, I think the recommendation is very helpful to determine the choice of drug. And one thing I'd like to ask all of you that the interferon, the systematic reviews on interferon versus placebo, the evidence was found to be of very low certainty. I think it is a little bit surprising that how anybody can explain about that a little bit more?
Yes, I think this is for you, Francesco.
Yes, thank you. I may say that since addressing the certainty and the available literature on interferon versus placebo was outside of the scope initially of the panel, but we, upon input from the panel, we just did instead of doing a systematic review on individual studies on interferon, we did a systematic review of network meta-analysis, existing network meta-analysis. So systematic reviews that put all alternatives, together by taking placebo as a common comparator and comparing it with interferon. So basically, these we found 3 systematic reviews with network meta-analysis. One was a Cochrane meta-analysis of 2015, and the other 2 were slightly older. One was slightly older, and the other one was from 2019, I guess. But they are all referenced in the GRADEpro. So of course, we considered in those reviews the outcomes that our panel voted as critical or important. Namely, what these reviews considered were relapse and disability. Okay, so when all these reviews included obviously all the pivotal trials of interferon, and although some of these studies, especially on interferon beta 1b, were definitely in favor of interferon, these studies had a low or very low certainty because of in some of the domains that Holger explained before, namely, imprecision, directness, and all the other domains that have been explained, the certainty was low, or they lowered the certainty that we have in those estimates. So we had, as Bassem said before, the studies on interferon are old. And the methodology was not as robust as it is today. Diagnostic criteria changed twice at least for some of those studies. So basically, just to make you an example, the diagnostic criteria in the 90s for multiple sclerosis may have included many patients that today would have been diagnosed differently. So this is limiting the directness, for example, of those estimates into our today's patients, okay? So that is the reason why the global certainty today in 2022 is lower than what it might have been in 1998, for example. I hope I'm answering your question.
Thank you, Francesco. So Kazuo, back to you. I think we still have 3 minutes.
Yes. Joanna, so we have only 3 minutes left. Any comments from you?
Just to mention a few things that were brought up in the discussion, which was really interesting to hear. So first of all, these recommendations are for low resource settings. So Kevin, you mentioned high income, low income, and we specifically defined it as low resources so that it could be in any country. And I think the second one around the application, which needs to be contextualized into different regions and different countries and different settings, that's absolutely our next step, thinking about how we can support different countries and thinking of how to best use these to help people with MS. And that's all from me, but I'm also, obviously, we're all very happy to also answer questions by email, or if there's any more questions in the last 2 minutes, we can also take those. That's all from me. Thanks, Kazuo.